So, welcome. We're glad you're here. As you see this on the screen, it'd be the next slide. There you go. As you see that on the screen, what do you think about? What do you think about? Maybe you think about terrorism. I think I'm echoing a bit. Maybe you think about violence. Maybe you think about planes hitting the Twin Towers or the Pentagon. Maybe you think about turning the volume down a little bit. Just a tad there, okay. Maybe you think about, I think God just wants to get our attention here this morning, okay. But maybe you think about loved ones that were affected or lives that were lost, or maybe you think about emergency responders who kind of sacrificially went in and just served, right? Or what do you feel? Maybe you feel sadness or disbelief over the fact that it even happened in the first place, or maybe hatred towards those who did it, or kind of a sense of desire of restitution or restoration or revenge. Maybe you feel a sense of patriotism or the way that people kind of surrounded each other as we went through the ordeal. You know, regardless of your individual thoughts or your individual feelings, the reality is any of us that are old enough to remember 9/11, we felt something. We thought something. We remember something. And our hearts burned within us because of what we thought and we remembered and we felt. And even though it's coming up on 20 years since it happened, I would imagine that most of us that are old enough to remember it and old enough to remember where we were and what was going on, we can remember a lot of the details of what was happening. For Joy and I, we were college students at Lancaster Bible College, and we were that morning in the library at Lancaster Bible College. And I remember in the library, we're there studying, and Joy's sister, who also attended, rushed in and said that a plane had hit one of the Twin Towers. And immediately we wanted to know more information about this because we were just unsure and we were in disbelief. And so the only place for us to run in the college was to the bookstore that had a radio that was playing the news of what was going on and was keeping us up to date, event by event, as the thing unfolded. And as we're there, the crowd of people showing up into the bookstore was larger and larger and larger of hearing about what had happened. As the day unfolded a little bit, the college kind of shut the classes down. They took us all to the chapel. They took us in there to explain what they knew and what was happening and had us kind of pray. And all we could do was just listen to the reports, hope for the best, and pray about what was happening with the situation. It wasn't until I got home a little bit later that day that I actually saw any of the footage of the planes hitting any of the buildings. And in fact, I mean, even just 2 hours from here, one of them was brought down. And we think of those events and we remember exactly what happened. You know, I wanted answers. Everybody wanted answers. As the day unfolded, there wasn't much answers other than it was an act of terrorism. We had been attacked and we had been violated, and we all felt that. We were unsure of anything, and we felt very little control over our lives at that moment. Now, why is this important as we're talking about an event that's going to have its 20th anniversary, but that anniversary is months from now? What does that have to do with today? Well, I think the events of what we felt and what we thought and what we can remember have a lot to do and have a lot of similarities to the way the disciples of Jesus felt after his death, his burial, and the day of his resurrection, before they had actually seen the risen Christ. There was a lot of questions, a lot of doubts, a lot of misunderstandings, and they wanted to know the answers to those things. And so the story we're going to look at today is kind of a bookend of everything we've been looking at over the last 8 months or so. We started a while back in Jesus' Greater series as we looked at Jesus through the Old Testament and how he's greater than all these Old Testament people, and yet we can see Jesus in the midst of that. And then we continued into the holiday season and then into Matthew and how we see Jesus through the book of Matthew. That ended last week as we looked at Matthew 28. And as these two disciples encounter Jesus, he reveals some things that they need to understand and some things that their hearts need to understand and that they needed to get. In fact, he's going to reveal several different heart conditions that these disciples have and that we ourselves experience. And if we really want to get what Jesus is saying, we need to have a proper understanding of how Jesus wants to take us from these different heart conditions to burning hearts of where he wants to move us. So the story picks up on Easter. It takes us way back before Matthew 28 and just gives us a glimpse into the hearts and the minds of these particular disciples that first Easter day. At this point in the day, the disciples had very little information. All they knew is that the women and a few of the disciples had seen that the tomb was empty. There was a vision of angels, and they said Jesus was alive, but nobody had seen him yet. And so we pick up the story that afternoon in Luke 24, starting at verse 13. And it reads as follows. That very day, two of them were going to a village named Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and they were talking with each other about all these things that had happened. And while they were talking and discussing together, Jesus himself drew near and went with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What is this conversation that you're holding with each other as you walk?" And they stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, named Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only visitor in Jerusalem who doesn't know the things that have happened in these days?" Let's just stop for a second, because we need to understand what's happening here. These two disciples were leaving Jerusalem. They're heading towards Emmaus, which is probably northwest, about 7 miles downhill from Jerusalem. They're basically heading home after the festivities. It's a 7-mile walk, and as they're walking, they're talking with each other. And they're obviously talking about the events of the past few days, probably everything from the triumphal entry of Jesus the Sunday before to his death, his burial, and these supposed appearances of angels, but nobody's seen Jesus yet. So quite a bit to talk about if you think about it. And as they're talking, Jesus himself comes walking down from Jerusalem, overtakes them, listens in and eavesdrops on their conversation, and decides to walk alongside with them. And while they're walking, Jesus does that. They don't recognize him, probably because Jesus is supernaturally disguising his appearance to them. And in kind of typical Jesus fashion, he asks the question, okay? He just wants to get to the heart of the issue. He asks the question, what is this conversation that you're having while you're walking? And it's interesting because, the disciples, they just kind of stop in their tracks. Like they're walking, all of a sudden they just stop. And I think they stop for probably at least 2 reasons. One is they're sad. They're dealing with a lot of sadness. They have unanswered questions, and they don't know how to deal with that. And as Jesus asks that question, it just elicits that sadness, that unknowingness, and they just have to stop. Secondly, I think they're just completely dumbfounded. Just completely dumbfounded because they're just sad and dumbfounded. And why? Why are they dumbfounded? Well, think of it this way. Let's compare it to 9/11 and COVID-19. I know we talk about COVID all the time, but I think this works really, really well here. Imagine yourself on 9/13/2001, so 2 days after the attack on 9/11, okay? Imagine yourself walking through Reedsville or Lewistown or wherever you live, and you're walking and you're talking with a friend or two about the events of 9/11. And you'd be talking about, what's been our response, what more do we need to know, who's our allies, what's going on, what's the president doing about it, what's our hopes and fears and all these things. And as you're talking, imagine somebody comes up behind you and is walking behind you and walks up to you and says, "What's this 9/11 thing you're talking about?" Now, I think probably most of us would probably stop in our tracks and be like, "What are you talking about?" Like everybody in the U.S. has to know about this. It's been all in the reports. Everybody's talking about it. We're trying to process through what's going on with this thing. And you have no idea whatsoever what we're talking about? Like, where have you been? Have you lived in a bubble for the last 2 days and have absolutely no idea of what's happening? That's kind of the response that's happening here. Or think of it this way. Think of it as COVID-19. Imagine you're walking again down the street today, anywhere in the world pretty much, and you're talking about something about COVID, and somebody walks up to you and says, "Well, what's this COVID thing you're talking about?" We'd be absolutely dumbfounded because we wouldn't expect anybody not to know something about what we're talking about. The whole world knows. Why is it that you know? And we'd probably have some emotional response to either of those two situations because of what had happened in all of those situations. When the disciples are there and they say, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who doesn't know these things that have happened in these days?" What they're basically saying, are you such a stranger? Are you such a stranger to Jerusalem that you have absolutely no idea what has happened? How in the world is it possible that you have no idea? How can you not know? Because the executions were public. Everybody was talking about it. It was all over the Jerusalem news if they had that. If there was a Jerusalem Facebook page, it was on there. I mean, it was everywhere. And so it's completely like, what's going on here? And so I think Jesus asked this for a reason. He wants to get to the heart of an issue. So these disciples are completely shocked by the question, and they're discouraged over the last 2 days of what's been going on. Just completely discouraged. And so what exactly are these disciples thinking? What are they feeling? What are they processing through as they go through this? Well, we're going to see that in the next section here. It says this, and he said to them, what things? I love it. Jesus just kind of gets in there. What things? And they said to him, concerning Jesus of Nazareth, a man who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and rulers delivered him up to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it's now the third day since these things have happened. Moreover, some women of our company amazed us. They were at the tomb early in the morning, and when they did not find his body, they came back saying that he even seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. And some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women said, but him they did not see. You know, first of all, again, I love Jesus in typical Jesus fashion, just asking a simple question. What things are you talking about? Now, what's funny about this is Jesus, more than anybody, knows all the details more intimately than anybody could have possibly known. And yet he wants to draw out these disciples and kind of get to the understanding of where they're at, where their hearts are at, where their expectations are at, and where their hopes are at. And he does exactly that. So here's kind of a basic summary of what they understand, what they thought, and what they felt. You don't need to write this down. It's not going to be up there very long. But I want you to get an idea and a glimpse of what they're dealing with at this time before they have actually seen the risen Christ yet or know that they have seen him. They basically saw Jesus as a prophet, but they kind of hoped he was more. They hoped he was the Christ. They blamed Jesus' death on the religious leaders. They hoped he would redeem Israel, probably politically from the Roman government. There were reports of an empty tomb. There were reports of Jesus being alive. They hadn't seen him yet. They were waiting for something to happen on the third day, but so far it's not what they expected. And they felt hopeless and disappointed. That's where they're at. That's what's going on. And the question I have for you is this. Have you been there in your life? I mean, not the exact situation, obviously, of what they're dealing with Jesus, but just think about it for a second. Maybe you've lived this way where you've looked up to someone who was great, and that person didn't fulfill all your hopes and your dreams. You know, others come into the situation and hurt someone you loved or yourself by evil actions. We put our hopes in something that didn't pan out exactly the way we wanted or we had expected it to work out. We heard reports of things that we're not sure what to believe or not believe. We waited for something to happen, but so far it hasn't, and it looks like it just is not going to happen for us. And so we're kind of left sad and hopeless and depressed and disappointed. Somewhat sounds like the last year or so of a lot of our lives. Maybe not exactly, but we've dealt with a lot of these things. And this is exactly what the disciples are dealing with. And so what's the condition of these disciples' hearts? And the reality is the disciples' hearts condition is they have dashed hearts. They've just been dashed to pieces. And the reality is because dashed hopes equals dashed hearts. Their hopes have been shattered. Things have not turned out the way they expected, and they're just waiting for something to happen. You know, all of us deal with unmet expectations. People, things, situations, they just don't meet to our expectations often. And when we're faced with unmet expectations, we also experience dashed hearts often. So, what were they expecting? Well, they were expecting a risen Jesus. And in their own words, they said, but him they did not see. They were just waiting to see whether the reports were true. They were basically saying, our disheartened, dashed hearts won't be lifted until we see evidence of the risen Christ. And they understood that the empty tomb was absolutely nothing. It meant nothing without a resurrected Jesus. It just meant nothing. And so they needed that evidence. And what's ironic about it is Jesus is literally there walking with them, talking with them, and experienced their dashed hearts with them and wanting to reveal what the solution is to that particular heart condition. So even though they don't recognize him, he's walking with them, wanting to hear about their dashed hearts, their dreams, and their unmet expectations, and he wants to help them with their misunderstandings. But the other great thing is he doesn't just want to listen to them. He actually wants to get into the weeds with them, and he wants to help them with the situation. And so these disciples, they just need a fuller picture of everything that Jesus has for them, and a fuller picture of what their hearts need to be moved to. So he wants to start a fire in their hearts and move them from a dashed heart to a heart that's on fire for him. So let's look at Jesus' response to them. And he said to them, "O foolish ones." Now, probably most of us don't want to hear that as a response, but "O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them all the scriptures and the things concerning himself. So what heart condition did Jesus say that these disciples had? Well, he said they had foolish, slow hearts. So they not only have dashed hopes and dreams and hearts, now they have these foolish, slow hearts. And so what does Jesus mean by "you foolish ones"? Well, the foolish ones is literally he's saying, you have not considered the teaching that I've previously given you. You have not considered the evidence that's in front of you. They were not letting the scriptures influence their thinking or their behavior at this point. Jesus had taught them for years how to think and what was going to happen, but they just didn't understand it or accept it. Also, he said they were slow of heart. And what he means by that is that they just were not easily persuaded. They were too easily given into doubt. We all have doubts. Pastor Luke talked about that last week, and that's fine. But they were too easily given into doubts. And their hearts and their minds were not quick enough to grasp what the prophets had plainly said. So, Jesus points out their expectations about Christ, and that it wasn't just what they thought, that he was just going to establish his kingdom right away. And he takes them through the Old Testament and shows himself and where he is in the Old Testament with them. You see, they wanted to experience the glory of Jesus. They wanted to experience Christ's kingdom without the suffering. They wanted the easy road. They didn't want the hard road. The hard road happened, and it wasn't what they liked or they expected. And so Jesus comes into that and shows that the Old Testament proved that the hard road had to happen before the glory happened. We can act the same way a lot of times. We like the results of hard work without the hard work. We like the development of our character because we've gone through a difficult thing without having to go through the difficult thing in our lives. We like the wisdom or the knowledge we gain through hard study or circumstances, but we don't like the hard study or the circumstances that brought us that wisdom or that knowledge. We like the beach body without having to do all the exercises of the beach body, okay? And it just doesn't work for us. And wouldn't it just be easier if our character and our thinking and our hearts and our bodies just developed the way that we want them to without all the pain? And Jesus' answer is no. That's not the way it works. It had to be this way. Sin demanded a payment. The payment was too big for anybody to pay except for Jesus himself. And so instead of just the glorious kingdom coming in to where they wanted it to be and how they wanted it to be, the hardship had to happen for the glory part to eventually happen for them. The Christ had to suffer, and he pointed to them clearly into the Old Testament so that they're understanding and they could get it. They needed that. By the way, Jesus could have just left them at that. He could have just left them there. Instead of leaving them and leaving their hearts dashed and foolish and dull and slow, he dug deep into the scriptures with them. He explained all the scriptures concerning himself, and he wanted to open up their hearts and replace their foolish, dashed hearts with ones that were going to burn for him. And that's what he wants to do for us. This has been a journey as we've been going through the last 8 months and looking at the Old Testament and who Jesus was there, and looking at the New Testament and who Jesus is there. And then as we're thinking through, reading through the New Testament together, and we just started that a couple of days ago, those things can be difficult. It's not easy to stay with it. But God can do something mighty and amazing and bring a burning heart through that as you walk through that experience. The difficulties needed for the burning to happen. So what happens next? Here's what Luke continues to say. So they drew near to the village to which they were going. He acted as if he was going further. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, for it is towards evening, and the day is now far spent." So he went in to stay with them. And when he was at a table with them, he took the bread and blessed it and broke it and gave it to them. And their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. Now, if you think about this, this is pretty amazing. Because as this encounter unfolds, And as the disciples' understanding is growing more and more, they're experiencing this newness with this new friend, this new companion that they have just met. And Jesus continues to show things to them. And as he's going to continue on his way, the urging is so strong to continue to meet with him and learn from him that they strongly urge him. It's a pretty strong term. They strongly urge him to come and stay with him. Now, this is beyond the typical, hospitality that somebody would often give. They wanted more time with him. They knew there was something different about this guy, and they just want to experience more of what he had to say, especially in the midst of all their circumstances. So what's that mean for us? Well, when you encounter Jesus and you truly walk and you talk with him, and he starts to open the scriptures up to you, you just want more and more and more of that. And you want to invite him into all aspects of your life, and you want to sit down and fellowship with him, and you want to sit down and you want to eat with him, and you want him to just tell you more and more about him. Or maybe you come across a stranger, or maybe even somebody you know, who starts to show evidence of a real life of Christ. And they have real evidence of who God is, and they show you through their life and through their explanation of who he is, and you just eat that up. And so you just cling to that person. Why? Because in the midst of difficulty, they're giving hope and they're giving truth, and they're giving you something that you need. And it's starting to create a burn within your heart. Maybe you encounter that through a person. Maybe you encounter that through your personal devotional time. Maybe you encounter that when you come here and you worship. Maybe you encounter that as you spend reading the New Testament with other people in the church. But God wants to do something in our hearts. And Jesus wanted to come into their lives, didn't want to just explain their misunderstandings and their messed up expectations and hopes, but he wanted to give them exactly what they needed, the very evidence that he was a risen Christ and that he had conquered sin and death. And so these two disciples get there, they're there with him, and suddenly, all of a sudden, in the breaking of the bread, something happened in the midst of that. Some say they might have seen his scarred hands. Some just in the nuance of that happening. These particular disciples weren't at the Last Supper, so maybe it was just even the feeding of the 5,000 or the 4,000. But there's something in what he did that they recognized him, and God supernaturally opened their eyes, and all of a sudden, there's Jesus, and they got more than they bargained for. They had the very evidence they had been looking for the entire time. And then all of a sudden, he vanished from their sight as soon as they got what they needed to see. This is exactly what they needed. They started the day off with dashed hearts, foolish and slow hearts, and all of a sudden, as the day was going on and Jesus was speaking truth into their lives, their hearts were slowly warming up and moving forward. So what happened, and what was their response to this amazing encounter? Well, Luke continues to tell us in verse 32 and following. It says, "They said to each other, 'Did not our hearts burn within us while he talked to us on the road, while he opened to us the scriptures?' And they rose that same hour and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and those who were with them gathered together, saying, 'The Lord has risen indeed and has appeared to Simon.' Then they told what had happened on the road and how he was known to them in the breaking of bread." Here, these two disciples encountered their third heart condition, burning hearts, or heartburn. No, not the type you get when you eat spicier Mexican food. But maybe if your heart's burning for Jesus and you're eating spicier Mexican food, it's a double heartburn, if you want. But here, Jesus is doing a mighty work in their life, and it's evident by what's happening in their life. Typically the word burn in the scriptures is used of a lamp burning that's giving off burning light. This is the only time in the New Testament it's used figuratively. And it's meant to mean deeply moved or deeply stirred within. Something moved and something was different. And they certainly were moved and stirred within, because they moved from having dashed hopes, having foolish hearts and slow hearts, to being warmed by the encounter with Jesus, and then they had to do something with those burning hearts. They just had to do something with it. They couldn't keep it to themselves. And earlier we're told that these traveling companions said, "Hey, stay with us, because the day is almost spent. Like, don't continue on your way." Some look at that and just say, well, they just want to spend more time with him, which I think is true. But the idea of here, what's happening is, it's getting into the evening, it's getting darker. And what's happening is, journeying at night with no light is dangerous, especially in that area and in that time. And so they're kind of like, hey, just stay with us, and we're going to invite you in. But what do? They do the exact opposite advice they had just given this companion. It didn't matter if there was potential danger ahead of them. It didn't matter if it was getting late. It didn't matter if they had a 7-mile journey back uphill to Jerusalem in the dark. Something had happened so extraordinary in their lives, their hearts were burning so hard that they had to go and they had to go share that with other people. They knew that the other disciples who might not have encountered the risen Christ yet needed to know evidence that he was alive and that something had happened. And so here they are, and they take off. And the scripture says, it says, they rose that hour, which doesn't mean within the hour. It means basically straight away. They basically probably left their meal behind that they had been starting with Jesus. They never got into it, and they left their hunger alone, and they just took off to go find the others. So why did their hearts burn in the first place? Well, I think the passage gives us some great evidence of that. Did not our hearts burn within us while he talked to us on the road and opened to us the scriptures? What we've been doing the last 8 months of looking for Jesus in the Old Testament and looking who he is in the New Testament, and what we've been doing now as we experience the New Testament together as a group, is just a small glimpse of what Jesus was doing with them. Can you imagine the scriptures that Jesus opened to them as they walked? Can you imagine how deeply he dug into the Bible? It says he started with the law, so the 5 books of Moses, and then the prophets, and then all the scriptures. He went through all the scriptures with them. I can just imagine them walking slowly as they're going down to Emmaus, absorbing in all the things that Jesus had been telling them in the past and how it connected with the Old Testament so they got it. I would have loved to have been a fly on one of the shoulders of the disciples just to hear how Jesus laid that out to them. And you think about this for a second. Most scholars and authors say that this is the greatest detail of the resurrected Jesus that we see. And not only that, but this is a model of how those in the book of Acts and later in the letters to the churches did ministry. What Jesus basically laid out for them and what he had taken them through, they later then shared with other people, and it became a model of how they told other people about who Jesus was. So it's pretty amazing. The story ends with them getting to Jerusalem, finding the others, and not only did they just encounter that, but they got additional evidence of Simon having encountered Jesus as well, which confirmed the resurrection. So, as we come towards an end here, how does heartburn happen anyway? Well, heartburn happens when the following things happen. When we invite Jesus to walk in fellowship with us is one way. Notice the disciples' words, did not our hearts burn within us while he talked with us on the road? Walking and talking and fellowship with Jesus gave them a chance to just have their hearts lit within them. And then later on it says they wanted him to stay longer with them. Why? Because they wanted that more fellowship time with him so their hearts could burn. Secondly, we encounter Jesus in the scriptures. You know, I know that we often talk about it's important to read the Bible and we need to read the Bible. But here's the reality of what they said. They said their hearts burned while he opened to us the scriptures. There was something as Jesus was opening the scriptures that just created a heartburn for them. And it should, because if he's the author of the book, and he's the one that knows how our hearts work in the first place, and he's the one who wants to take our hearts in the right direction, then the Bible is going to get us that way. And so Jesus wants us to spend time there. So I encourage you to dig deep into the New Testament as we're doing that, or into your own personal studies. Third, heartburn happens when we recognize Jesus as he reveals more of himself to us. Now, this seems kind of vague, and it is, but the reality is this. He walked and he talked with them, and they didn't recognize who he was for quite a while. And Jesus reveals himself to us in a bunch of different ways. The question is, are we letting our hearts be open enough to listen to how he's revealing himself to us? And when we finally do recognize what he's saying and how he's revealing himself, are we going to let it do something in our hearts? As they recognized more and more who he was, and then when he finally revealed himself to them, it just created such a heartburn within them. And fourth, heartburn happens when we share the stories of our encounters of Jesus with other people. You notice it just didn't end there. They said, well, didn't our hearts burn within us while he walked with us and talked to us on the road, and then when he opened the scriptures? But what did they do with it? Well, their hearts were burning, and they wanted to share that with others, and so they just take off, and they go share the stories of the encounter. And it just creates even more of a burn within them, because when they get there, they hear more reports of the risen Jesus, which creates just not burn within them, but within other people. And so these are important things for us. So just kind of applications as we end. What heart condition are you dealing with today? Are you dealing with a dashed heart because your hopes have been dashed and expectations unmet in life? If so, Jesus can help instill hope in those matters, and he really can make a difference. Maybe you're dealing with a foolish, slow heart because you have lingering doubts and are unwilling to search deeper into God's word about what he has to say. Maybe consider spending some time in the scriptures and see what Jesus wants to do there. Or maybe your heart is burning for him, and what you need to do about it is you just need to share it with other people to spread that burn to other people. Why is your heart in the current condition it's in? Jesus wants to help to get to the bottom of whatever condition you're in, whether it be the good ones or the bad ones, and he wants to keep that heart burning for him. And maybe what step can you take today to rekindle heartburn in your own life if it's not currently happening? Maybe you need to invite Jesus into your life for the first time because you just hadn't encountered him yet or saw him as a risen Christ. Maybe you need to walk or talk with him or fellowship with him a little bit more because you've lost that. I've had moments of those times in my life. He's here right there walking with you. Sometimes we just don't notice it. Or maybe you're searching for him and you need to search for him more in his word. Or maybe you're just, it's just recognized a little bit more of how he's been working in your particular life. Or maybe your heart is burning and you just need to find some people to share it with. That's what Jesus wants to do in our lives. And as always, Kish is here to provide any guidance we can to move you through the various stages of the heart conditions that you're dealing with. Let's take a moment and pray. Heavenly Father, we're thankful that you're a God who reveals yourself. We're thank you in the midst of dashed hopes and hearts and slow hearts that you're a God that shows who you are, and you've given great evidence and revealing of that. And so, Lord, as we think about where our hearts are at and where you want to move them, I ask that you let us search you out. Let us get a fresh understanding and view of who you are. And as we do that, that our hearts burn within us and we can't help but to share it with others. It can't stay contained. And we see such a fire move across our Kish family and into our community and into our neighborhoods and into our schools because you do something amazing. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.